bread making has been part of human history for the past 10,000 years. But, for my money, the best type of bread is brioche. It's buttery, it's tasty, it's just such a great treat, it's amazing. So, join me today as I make some brioche bread and talk about the science behind it. Early humans had no idea why bread worked. They had wheat, sugar, water, and they just kind of put it all together. Some made flat bread, some made risen breads, but all around the world, people were united on one thing. Every culture has some type of bread, and they did this for thousands of years. But then, in 1400, the first mention of brioche, which is French, came about. Randall Cartgrave wrote a description of brioche for his dictionary. So brioche has been around since at least 1400, and it's been slowly and continuously improved by bakers and pastry makers. Probably the biggest evolution for brioche came after Louis XIV, when butter became way more common and could be used more freely and easily. So we're going to get 4.5 grams active dry yeast, add it to 60 milliliters of milk, and then add in 5 milliliters of honey. This is one of the most important parts of the bread making process. The heat of the milk will activate the yeast, and the yeast feeds on the sugar in the honey. So the yeast then multiplies, which is going to be super helpful later. Alright, so now we're going to whisk together 2 large eggs and 1 egg yolk. The eggs help emulsify the dough and hold everything together because of the lecithin molecules in the yolks. These molecules hold together water and fat, which is going to be super important because of all the butter we're adding to the bread. Alright, so into the eggs, we're going to add 5 milliliters of vanilla, 5 grams of sea salt, 20 grams of white sugar, 125 grams of all-purpose flour, and 125 grams of bread flour and whisk together. The vanilla and the sugar are really just there for flavors, but the flours are super important. The flour provides the protein in the dough. The bread flour has a slightly higher protein content than all-purpose. The protein content is what distinguishes all these types of flour, so that's where you get stuff like cake flour or pastry flour, but we're just using all-purpose and bread flour today. These proteins, glutenin and gliadin, when added to liquid, create gluten. Gluten development is the primary process in bread making. Gluten holds in the air, so more gluten allows for a stronger dough. We're going to use a mix of both so we can get both an airy texture while still having a nice crumbly loaf of bread. And now into that we're going to add our bloomed yeast, which should look a lot different than when we left it. So now, with everything together, we're going to mix it until it becomes a nice dough, and then we're going to knead it out. Kneading is a really important process. It mixes everything together and makes it all uniform. It also allows the proteins we just talked about to actually become gluten. Kneading also allows the starch, which comes from the sugar in the flour, to meet up with certain enzymes and create glucose, a sugar which is going to be super helpful when we proof the dough. Now that we have a scraggly dough, we're going to slowly add in the butter, a bit at a time, and kneading until it's all incorporated. The butter is what gives the bread its flavor. Butter is fat, which does a couple things. It makes the bread softer, and it also slows down the staling process. The reason we didn't add it earlier is because the fat can also prevent the flour from becoming gluten. So we're adding it after our initial knead so we still get some nice gluten development. Alright, so now we're going to shape it into a ball and let it rise for around an hour until it's doubled in size. This is where the yeast comes in. So, the yeast is a type of fungi. The yeast colonies feed off the glucose and send out carbon dioxide and ethanol. The ethanol gets lost when the loaf is in the oven, but the carbon dioxide is the main part here. The carbon dioxide gets trapped in the gluten, making a nice, airy dough. This is also why breads rise when they're in the oven. So we're going to actually be doing a few different proofs to really give the bread a nice texture. We don't want to leave it out for too long since it might overproof and deflate. So our next proof is going to be in the fridge for around 12 hours overnight. So we're just going to punch down the dough, reform it, and then put it in the fridge. Alright, we're almost done. So now we're going to give it another punch down and shape it. I'm doing this really neat design I found online, but this is your chance to be creative. You can do whatever shape you want. Also, you can use them to make cinnamon rolls here, which I highly recommend, super yummy. Alright, so for this shape, I just divided it into 8 pieces, made them into little balls, and then put them in the pan. Now that it's in a greased pan, we're going to let it proof for another 2-ish hours. This final proof is going to raise the temperature of the dough from how cold it was in the fridge and will also allow it to take the shape we're giving it in the pan. And now it's going to go into a 325 degree Fahrenheit oven for around 40-ish minutes until it's 190 degrees inside. So one thing I forgot here initially, which I'm doing now, is the egg wash. So for the egg wash, I'm just beating an egg with a little bit of water, but the egg wash is super important. It helps with what's called the Maillard reaction. Usually you hear this when you're talking about cooking certain meats, but it also applies here. So for the Maillard reaction here, the protein in the eggs is reacting with the sugar in the dough, and it's forming something called an amidori compound. These compounds then react with each other in the heat of the oven and create a nice brown crust. The longer you leave it in the oven, the more brown it is. So if I didn't forget, I would have put the egg wash on before I put it in the oven, so it's really, really nice and brown, but it still works here. And there we have it. We have some nice bread and some sweet science facts. This bread is super good, especially with some jam. It took a long time, but it wasn't super difficult. The hardest part was probably the plastic wrap. I struggled with that quite a bit. But yeah, that's all for now.